Well, good morning. We'll call our meeting to order, and we have one task in front of us today. So I'd like to welcome everyone for the completion of this task, which is to work House Bill 2569. And been a little while since we heard it. And David, could you give us a refresher on House Bill 2569?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2569 would enact two new sections of law. Section 1 would name KSA 7932, Com 211, and Sections 1 and 2 of the bill as the Historic Kansas Act. Section 2 establishes an income, privilege, and premium tax credit for all taxable years commencing after 2021. It would be an amount equal to 10% of qualified expenditures incurred for the restoration and preservation of qualified structure. An additional tax credit of 10% of qualified expenditures may be allowed if for the installation of fire suppression equipment or materials. The total amount of expenditures would have to be at least $2,000, but not more than $1 million. And then financial institutions would pay taxes on 25% of the interest earned on loans to qualified taxpayers used for those restoration and preservation expenditures, or for the installation of that fire suppression equipment. The tax credit is allowed to be carried forward for 10 years, and such tax credit may be assigned. No person claiming the credit under this section may claim a credit for the same structure under the existing historic preservation tax credit in 7932 Com 211. The bill does define qualified expenditures to mean the costs and expenses in the restoration and preservation of a qualified structure that is at least 50 years old. Qualified structure means any building, whether or not income producing, that includes residential, commercial, and agricultural buildings. And qualified taxpayer means the owner of that structure. Section 3 amends the existing tax credit for expenditures incurred in the restoration and preservation of historic structures on the Register of Kansas Historic Places by adding language to increase the amount of the tax credit provided by such section to 30% of qualified expenditures if the structure is located in a city with a population between 9,500 and 50,000, and 40% of credit if the structure is located in a city with a population of less than 9,500. The bill would strike language requiring the total amount of expenditures incurred for the preservation of a qualified historic structure to be equal to $5,000 or more to qualify for the credit. Under current law, that tax credit is 25% of qualified expenditures, or 30% if expenditures are incurred in preservation of a structure that's exempt from federal income taxation pursuant to Section 501c3 and is not income producing if the total amount of such expenditures equals $5,000 or more. Under the bill, the tax credit for the 30% for the 501c3 structures would be in addition to the 25, 30, or 40% credit instead of being one or the other, as in current law. For the 501c3 structure, the total amount of such expenditures being $5,000 or more to qualify, that remains in place as under current law.
Questions for David? Thank you, David, very much. Okay, we're going to now take up House Bill 2569, and do I have a motion concerning 2569? Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I motion to pass out 2569 favorably.
Is there a second? Second, Representative Baker. Now we'll go, I'll say, are there any amendments? And I have an amendment for it, and if David could pass it out. One of the concerns that I think was raised by myself and others was, one, the potential cost of this program and the broadness of it, and was it hitting most of the testimony rotated around downtown historic buildings, upper story housing, and so once we get it out, I'll kind of go through in order to one, pare down the potential cost, and second, to kind of direct it to what we heard in the testimony on this. And okay. First, I think I'll go through kind of the discussion on the amendments so you'll understand what happens, and then we'll come back to the action. But this is to kind of go through it. And so on page 1 of the amendment, and instead of repealing the existing section, it's replacing. And I have to appreciate the help that, pardon?
Mr. Chairman, when it says repealing the existing section, that's, we do that in every bill. When we amend an existing statute, we then, so we don't have to print both the amended version of the statute and the existing version. We just repeal what is there, and it's replaced with the amendment, so it's.
Okay. Any other changes other than the original one that I had? I don't think so. So in this, we'll go through, and on the 10% tax credit, it is, instead of the word qualified expenditures, and let me see here. I see one. Yeah, I was looking to see whether on line 11, in the one I had, it said for commercial structures at least 50 years old that do not receive tax credits in section 3. 19, okay, okay.
Mr. Chairman, yes, it's, since the tax credit is, the owner, the taxpayer actually receives a tax credit, not the structure. We just went ahead and moved that down, so it's actually that language is now actually in line 18 to equal to 10% of, I'm sorry, line 19, restoration and preservation of a commercial structure that's at least 50 years old and does not receive tax credits. So it's, yeah, it doesn't, because the tax credits go to the taxpayer, not necessarily to the structure.
Okay, and everything else then looks the same. So that is saying that it's at least, it's a commercial structure, and that commercial structure, what it in essence does, it eliminates it eliminates residential, agricultural buildings and other structures like that to narrow down the base, and a commercial structure that's over 50 years old and then is not receiving the other tax credits. Instead of qualified on line 18, qualified expenditures, that's changed to cost and expenses for the 10% credit. And same way on line 20, cost and expenses, because they, under this 10% credit, it's outside of the ones with a historic designation. So in the historic tax credits, there are qualified expenses and qualified expenditures. These are the cost and expenses taken on these buildings that are 50 years old or older under the 10% program. On line 23, taking the $2,000 in line 23 and raising that to $25,000. So it would eliminate a number of, it wouldn't take $2,000 probably wouldn't even get you a paint job on the front of the building or whatever. So this would bring it up to where the expenditures would still be reasonable, but would eliminate a lot of very small projects, which would be part of the cost that revenue had when they were looking at these small projects. The other thing is on the high side shall not exceed $1 million, moved it down to $500,000, which in many cases should cover a number of the structures in a downtown area. On line 26, it says for a year in which the rehabilitation was begun, it says when it was completed. So the begun would maybe never be finished. It might be a lifetime project, but this says when it's completed, then this would fall into place. And then on line 32, just an or in there, savings and loan banks, savings and loan associations, or savings banks, and credit union is removed. And the 25% on line 33, which means that 75% of the interest income would be exempt. This makes it 50% of the interest income would be exempt. Again, expenditures change to costs and expenses, and then a qualified structure is now defined as a commercial structure at least 50 years old. When you go over to page 2, then you go, and the things as used in this section, qualified expenditures, qualified structures, and qualified taxpayers are stricken because it's now a commercial structure 50 years or older. And that lines out where it said it included residential, commercial, agricultural buildings. That is now down to just a commercial structure. So residential and ag are out of it. And in lines, down at line 38, the Director of Taxation is authorized to adopt rules and regulations as necessary to administer this part of the program, which will be the 10% that will not be under the historic side. These could be old enough, I guess there'd be some that could, but they don't want to go through the red tape, so they can get the 10% side. So this will be under the Department of Revenue, and I think as we discussed when we talked about the bill, that you'll make the deduction, and it will be, if you are audited, you'd have to produce the expenditures and what you did, what you spent the money on that you deducted on your taxes. So under that section of this, any particular questions? Representative Burkamp?
So on the commercial structure piece, if it'd be like 50% residential, so I'm thinking like a downtown building that used to be commercial, but they're converting over to residential, like maybe residential on the top floor and commercial on the bottom, would that not qualify, or would only like the bottom part qualify?
I think that would qualify, that it would be a commercial. And some of the definitions that I saw, looking at what a commercial structure is, they talked about mixed-use buildings where there was retail or service on the bottom floors and housing on the top floor, or you could make it housing on the top floor. So I think they would qualify.
Okay. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if there was a percentage, but.
I don't know, do you know of a percentage, David? I mean, in some definitions, it just said that, they were commercial. Could be a number of things, but I think in a downtown area, what I was reading talked about kind of mixed-use structures, not that, because they were generally, you either had retail or you were going to put retail on the bottom and you wanted to put housing up above, and then this bill retains the part in it where there is some money available to for sprinklers if needed.
Okay, thank you.
Any, Representative Osmond?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One really quick question, possibly for David. Page 1, line 22. The total amount of such expenditures, we've taken out the reference to qualified expenditures on all references on this document, but it still lists expenditures. So what is that in reference to?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that wouldn't be the expenditures for the costs and expenses. I mean, I think if we wanted to then conform that to the other expenditure pieces, that might have just been a miss there. So could say total amount of such costs and expenses.
Okay, would that clear it for you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe so, yeah. I just wanted to make sure, because if we were taking out expenditures as a reference point to this, I just wanted to clarify, because when we did so, if there's no reference to what an expenditure is, I want that to be clear in here. So yes, if it actually is costs and expenses, then yes, switching it over to that would make sense.
Yeah, and I think the qualified was taken out because under a historic renovation where you're getting tax credits, there are certain things that are qualified expenditures, and not all of them maybe are, would be, they're more expansive than what there might be under this. So if that kind of clears it up, that we could make that change. Okay. Representative Weigel, did you have a question? Oh, Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a tax credit already in place on some of that for 10% on his question. So that should help with that. Also, these buildings, when they come back on the tax roll, they come on at a higher rate because they're taxed as commercial buildings. So that'll really change the dynamics of those communities as we go forward, as these buildings come back on, as the exemptions run out.
Any other comments, questions? David, any other things you would emphasize under new section 1?
Mr. Chairman, if you look at, I think if the intent of the committee is to then strike all references to expenditures or qualified expenditures, we may also need to make some adjustments on what would be now on page 2 on what would be the new subsection D. There's a couple references in like line 29 and 32. I think that's just, if the intent of the committee is just replace all references to qualified expenditures to costs and expenses, and maybe ask for technical authorization to make those changes if they come up.
Okay, so we'd want to include that in our motion to give you the ability to make needed technical corrections. Okay. Okay. I think went through there now. The other portion, there's not a lot of changes in the other portion, which we're talking about a tax credit program where it has to be a qualified building. It has to be, there are plans of work that have to be submitted and approved on these that get the higher tax credit. And these are adjustments for communities 50 to 9,500 and below 9,500. And so in the, there are some, I think mainly it's a rehabilitation plan by a qualified taxpayer. This is on line 7, page 3. If the total amount of such expenditures equals 5,000 or more, that 5,000 is the same number that was there before. And then under 2, which is the 30% qualified expenditures, cities 9,500 to 50,000, same that it is 5,000 or more for expenditures pursuant to a qualified rehabilitation plan. And then the 40%, let's see, I'm trying to figure out the balloon number 3 there, that comes in at line 15, then basically to follow 9,500 on, yeah, is same thing, pursuant qualified rehabilitation plan for 5,000 or more. And on this particular one, would want to point out there are not dollar limits. I mean, there's not a maximum dollar limit on this because you can see on line 20 to 22, in 2010, there was a $3,750,000 line, and that was before my time here, but evidently it pretty much killed the tax credit program in Kansas for financial backing on it because of an uncertainty on what you could do if projects were bigger than that. So anyway, this more or less complies or falls in line with the federal side on tax credits, that it doesn't put a cap on them. And the other thing that was brought up when David mentioned it, on line 15, when you read it before, it said, in addition, an amount equal to 30% for 501c3s, but the original intent, I believe, was not to give, in essence, like a 70% credit. This was to say, if you are a 501c3, then you could get a 30% credit. So, so this is an or instead of in addition to. And I think that was one that it was not originally intended to be an add-on for someone to have nearly credits for nearly 3/4 of a project. So anyway, and this also was another way to bring the cost under control. And then same way with the banks and savings and loans, line 33, it's a 50% instead of pay tax on 50% rather than 20, then pay tax on just 25%. And on page 5, the executive director of the State Historical Society is authorized to adopt rules and regulations on these historic tax credits. So one of the things that was in, I think, the budget director's letter on the fiscal note, that there was nothing defined on who did what as far as the Historical Society or the Revenue Department. So this puts the Historical Society on the historic tax credits, and it puts the Department of Revenue on the tax credits that are the 10% and are not qualified historic structures. So when we get into the qualified tax credit side, what questions, comments, or does anyone have? Any questions? David, any comments on the historic tax credit side? No? Okay. One thing that I thought it might be good to do, the fiscal note, when we looked at it before, had kind of, on the 10% side, it had, you were looking at a fairly large range as to what the cost could be. And with the help of Christy Davis and some that she worked with, she gave an early estimate of what this might do to the fiscal note. I know that Melissa and Heather are working with Revenue and all to come up with a revised fiscal note when we go, if we get this out and bring it to the floor, that will have a number from hopefully a revised estimate, at least going through the the budget director and come up with an adjustment. But thought it might be valuable, and Christie, if you could come up and kind of give a little bit on some of your thoughts on what you think these changes could possibly have done. Nothing official here, but at least a thought from what you looked at it and the work you did on it.
Oh, I'm not on. Now I'm on. When we had the hearing on February 14th, we had not seen the fiscal note actually until the committee hearing, and it was surprising to us too. At that time, they were suggesting that this legislation would have a fiscal note of $83 million, and that was because of some projections they made based on the number of buildings in Kansas that are more than 50 years old. What we learned was that approximately 90% of the buildings in Kansas that are more than 50 years old are single-family residences. And so therefore, simply by just taking those out, there's a huge impact as far as the fiscal note is concerned. If just 10%, if the other 10%, and again, this is just anything that isn't single-family, and we know that there are a lot of property types that aren't single-family, that are also not commercial. For instance, churches, institutional-type structures. Between narrowing that focus to 10% of the properties and also raising the minimum project cost to what was originally intended, actually it was raised from $2,000 to $25,000 in the balloon amendment. We believe that the maximum fiscal note for the legislation would be, at this time, approximately $20 million. That's a maximum. Because we were looking at, well, we estimated $24.6 million when we were considering just removing single-family residences, but as the chairman noted, the proposed amendment also eliminates other property types as well that are not commercial. And I'd be happy to answer questions on that.
Any questions? And so that would be I think when we talk, that'd be the maximum, and that would be that the program really taking off, and there's stuff going on all over the state, and I would not expect that because someone still has to have the money on the other end to do it. So, quite a change in the maximum, and I think when we looked at the other one, the maximum kind of everyone did it was 200 and some.
If the calculation with the 200 million in the initial fiscal note was if everyone who had a property that was more than 50 years old took advantage of this program every year. I mean, it was just, so you're spending, I mean, now that we've raised the minimum, the chances of any one building owner taking advantage of this year after year are pretty slim, let alone all of them. May I also ask a question? Will?
Yes.
I do want to clarify something in the amendment. The language in the amendment that you're looking at in the first paragraph says, and repealing the existing section on lines 3 and 4. And then on page 5, let me see. The language also says KSA 7932-211 is hereby repealed. The language at the start of section 3 says KSA 7932-211 is hereby amended. The other sections start with new section 1 and new section 2. This says hereby amended. I want to make sure that we're not amending the current statute and repealing it. So one of the thoughts that we had was removing that language at the end about repealing, and in the first paragraph on page 1, instead of saying repealing, say replacing, Or I think we would be covered if the language was new section 3, but I would defer to the revisor on that.
David?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, when we say repealing the existing section, this is standard language in every bill when we amend, a current KSA section. Because what we do is then, you have the existing KSA 7932, that's in the statute book now. We're going to then repeal that portion that's in the book, and it actually is going to be replaced with the amended version in the bill. So that way we don't have the amended 7932 in the book and the old version, the existing version of it in the statute. We remove that old one. It does get replaced with the new as amended version in the bill if it becomes law. So it actually does make the replacement, but it is a little bit confusing at times. It comes up, usually a couple times every year, but it's just kind of the standard way we structure it.
I just wanted to confirm that the intent is to, in fact, enhance the historic tax credit program rather than repeal it as confirmation for our supporters. So, thank you.
Representative Shu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Christy, and thank you, Representative Proctor. I know everybody's done a lot of work and on this, and I just want to make a quick comment because I mentioned it earlier in the hearing. I do think there's a really valuable conversation to be had about kind of rehabbing old building stock, especially in rural areas. Anyways, single-family homes included. Obviously, we'll take the bite of that apple that we can actually chew at the current moment, but going forward, it's something to look at. I know there's a lot of older stock that probably could be updated for new use, modern use, and so looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good future conversation to have, to maybe look at, since a lot of these will be in downtowns, get the downtown and then look at ways to move out and some of the old housing stock that's like whatever the name of the TV show that has good bones, but it could come back and it needs some work. So, other questions, comments? Representative Toplicker?
So we're looking at a fiscal note of 20 million and not to exceed or approximately, and is that several years out or 1 year, or what's that projection?
It's based on a per year, a percentage of projects, and I will say that, as you all will see, the bulk of the fiscal note has to do with the new Section 2, which is the proposed 10% credit for buildings that are more than 50 years old, regardless of historic designation. The fiscal note for the enhancements that are included in Section 3 is estimated conservatively, so maximum 2.5 million, and that's all projected based on past performance.
I think maybe talked about, and I know that Representative Burkamp had requested some information, but I think historically, rural towns, 9,500 and less, have not had a lot of money spent in them, or not a lot of tax credit programs compared to some of the larger urban areas, and mainly probably because of the complexity of it. Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So coming out of the commercial side of these things, there's a lot of federal money for those urban areas. There's millions and millions of dollars every year in federal tax credits that go to those big projects in the metro area. The rural areas don't qualify for those. It's mainly just the urban areas. So it's not like they've been neglected. They've had a really good deal for a long time.
Any other comments or questions? Representative Poskin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious, so the population is supposed to direct this money to rural, correct? Because, you know, I just looked up, the city of Roland Park is under 9,000. The city of Leawood is 35,000. So could we not take advantage of those as well? And would Representative Shu's constituents get more money than mine?
Well, going by population levels, I guess, I don't know, David, you might have a comment, but it doesn't designate in a rural area. It just designates or a county of a certain size. And I mean, and that would be something to consider, whether it, although 50,000, when you look at 50,000 and all, as a city, it's probably going to be in a county quite a bit more than 50,000. And I think the 50,000 comes about by looking at Representative Proctor's bill, original bill. Any issue or any thoughts on that? I mean, it could be a city with in an urban area less than between 50 and 0 that could get some of the assistance on it. No. Representative Burkamp?
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I guess in my ideal mind, it'd be like in rural opportunity zones, I mean, would be a qualifier for this program, but that's just my thought.
Yeah, and that would, you run into the category that would take out Representative Proctor's district. But Christie, any thoughts on this?
That's an astute observation, Chairman Kelly. Yes, we did look at the definition for rural opportunity zones. We also looked at HUD's definition for rural. Their focus on the majority of their programs identifies communities. It's usually municipalities with a population under 50,000. And the reason that we identified that as the benchmark versus the Rural Opportunity Zone program is that many of these projects in urban communities take advantage of CDBG money from HUD. And in communities that are 50,000 or more, they're entitlement communities, and so they allocate their own HUD funding. Those of us who are in communities that are smaller than 50,000, we compete for the scraps. We have to prepare competitive applications for every single project rather than getting the money directly from the federal government and allocating it ourselves. So that's why that 50,000 was determined, because communities of 50,000 or more have access to other funding sources.
Any concern on your part that most of your operations are in rural areas, that it could be Leawood, or it could be a community in Johnson County or some other county that is in the county but has a smaller number of, falls in within the population guidelines?
Well, with all due respect, I know it's popular to think of Sedgwick and Johnson County as separate entities from other communities in the state, but we do work in rural communities in a number of those counties that have a lot of the same issues that rural communities in other counties have as well. And in addition, can't leverage the financing that the larger communities can.
Okay, so not a concern on your part.
No, sir.
Representative Poskin, any thoughts you want to?
Nope, just listening, thanks.
Okay. Okay, thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christie. Any other questions, comments on the amendment? Okay, well, on the amendment, I will move my amendment. Have a second by Representative Hoheisel. And any additional discussion at all? No. Well, I would close on my motion to amend. All of those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Okay, we're back on the bill as amended. And Representative Hoheisel, would you want to adjust your amendment to include the technical correction provision that David would like to have?
Yeah, absolutely. Close, or I guess, do you want me to close now? Do you want me to close?
Well, I do, but David, do we need to do something specific to give you the technical correction? On the motion was for the bill itself as written. Do we need to put a technical correction comment in there?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if you would be able, I mean, we could just do that within the balloon amendment, just have to strike on page, I believe I've caught all of them, page 2, line 29, strike qualified expenditures and insert costs and expenses, and then make the same amendment on page 2, line 32, strike qualified expenditures and insert costs and expenses. And then on page 1, it would be line 22, strike expenditures and insert costs and expenses. So it'd be, you'd make that part of the motion to amend. I think that would take care of it.
Okay, so now we've already done the amendment, but I think that's what I said. I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we will go and go that it is there so that you have the leeway to do what you need to do. And so Representative Hoheisel, would you like to close on your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I close on my motion to pass out HB 2569 favorably as amended.
Okay, we have the motion to pass out 2569 favorably as amended. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. 2569 is passed out favorably. So I think I mentioned that I thought we could end up with our committee this week, but that's not going to happen. Yesterday, we have a couple of bills that are coming our way from the Senate. They're going to be under conference committees, but they're things that our committee has not heard before. One's a child care tax credit, and one is involves housing. And so they're coming over, one of them's coming over in a RAS bill that we passed out last year, but it sat in the Senate. They're both coming in, been assigned to us. So on Monday, we're going to need to have basically an informational hearing on one of the two, and on Wednesday, an informational hearing on the other, so that it will have touched our committee and we will have picked up the information on it. So it appears, unless something changes, on Monday and Wednesday, we will have meetings. And the only bright side is that next week on Monday and Wednesday and through the week, it's supposed to be 50s and 60s and not 7 to 9 inches of snow or whatever that it's going to be at the end of this week. So just plan on, unless you get something differently from Rich, that we will meet Monday morning and we will meet Wednesday morning, and those will be our last 2 committee meeting days. Any other thing for the good of the committee? If not, we're adjourned, and thanks everyone, and thanks for the help on this, Christie and Representative Proctor and